This was posted a few hours ago by Ship Sailing 94. In your opinion, what makes the experience of Hexcrawl significantly different from a dungeon crawl? How can this difference be accentuated? Well, let's see. What makes the experience of a Hexcrawl significantly different from a dungeon crawl? That's a good one. So there are a couple of procedural things that I would look to. One is that you don't tend to have hard walls. In a dungeon, you are going to be limited in some way by the architecture of the dungeon. Walls, doors, things like that. You have to move around. It's that kind of maze. A hex crawl, you can go any way you want to. And at some point, depending on your abilities and your spells, whatever, your flight becomes available. You almost get an entire, I suppose you could, if you had some kind of a tunneling property, or I don't know, maybe if you're playing a mole person, you have a tunneling speed. You could even go down to the earth. There's very few walls. So it's wide open. And Ian said the same thing in chat. There are always six directions to go. Yeah, exactly. 6 directions to go. And the scale of time is different. In a dungeon, we're talking seconds in terms of encounters, which I suppose counts in the wilderness as well. So maybe we'll say, taking combat out of the mix, we'll say minutes, hours. Hex crawling, you're talking hours, days. Ian also says probably fewer traps, puzzles. I suppose it's the nature of definitely fewer traps. You're not going to run into a lot of traps in the wilderness. Puzzles kind of depends on your idea of puzzles. I like to think of most of the puzzles I use are kind of environmental puzzles, right? So something like you enter a room and you have a hole in the floor and you have a shaft in the ceiling, but the shaft in the ceiling is at the top of a 40-foot dome and the hole in the floor is 40 feet wide, and the shaft leads to the center of the hole. You want to get up the shaft, you figure out how am I going to get up into this shaft, right? You think, well, once we're up there, we could try to use pythons or ninja climbing claws or something to get up there, but we got to get up there. How do we do all this stuff? That kind of environmental puzzle is there in the dungeon, and it certainly can exist in the wilderness. In the wilderness, it might take a different form, such as, okay, we have a raging river. We don't know where the nearest ford is, if there is one, but we really need to get across here and now. How do we do that? Kind of similar kind of puzzles could take place. And then Ian says, unless your campaign world is Elden Ring, then there's still traps. I am interested in giving Elden Ring a try. I watched some of I guess they had some kind of trial or beta, and I saw some of the videos on that. It looks really cool. I never played a lot of those games, the whatchamacallit games. Spacing out on the name, those just really hardcore, just die over and over and over and over again games. But Elden Ring does look pretty cool. So those are the differences that you have. Now, it's interesting the author's take here is how can we accentuate this difference? Because part of what I think, and maybe I'm wrong, is I like when there is it's seamless transition from dungeon to the wilderness. Sure, there's some things we have to do. We're going to start to speed up time in the wilderness when if our segments of dungeon travel are essentially 120 feet, aka 10 minutes. Well, now our section of travel in the wilderness is going to be multiple hours and a mile or multiple miles, however you want to do it. So there's, Ian says Dark Souls / Bloodborne. Thank you, Dark Souls. And what was the other one? There's another one too. Is Dark Souls and Bloodborne? Wasn't there also like Demon Souls? Maybe that's related to Dark Souls. Yeah, I kind of played a little bit of, I think, one of the Dark Souls games, but maybe this Elden Ring seems to kind of be interesting to me in a way that those aren't. Anyway, back to dungeon versus wilderness. As a player, I think as a GM, I want to kind of keep the game flowing. If we think about in a video game sense, when you cut from, let's say, it's depending on the game, it's been less like this recently, but in old school, or I mean say old school, in older games, a lot of times you would have this loading screen between when you would be in the overworld, let's say in a Final Fantasy VII, and then you get to a town or a location, and then you kind of have loading, and maybe you do one of those little swirly animations, and suddenly you'd be kind of zoomed in. For me, at the table, I don't want players to feel like they're going into another mode. I want it to feel kind of all of a piece, that the movement, everything never really ends.Maybe now we're going to span more time instead of talking in minutes, we're going to be talking in hours worth of effort in segments. But I at least for the kind of localized travel, if we're talking like doing an Indiana Jones, we're in Virginia or wherever he is, and he's flying all the way to Kathmandu, sure, maybe that's appropriate because we're not really hex crawling. We're just going to go woo over. But if we're going to do the whole hex crawl thing, I'm not really looking to accentuate the differences because I want it to all feel pretty seamless. I want people to feel like they're part of the same world and not that we're moving from system A to system B, that sort of thing. And I think that's also a lot of people complain about with combat is it feels like you're moving from system A to system B. That it can feel a little bit disjointed. And for me, I want to reduce it. I want it to feel as smooth and seamless as possible. I want my players to be able as much as possible to use the same language, the same kind of things they're talking about, whether they're in a dungeon or whether they're in a forest. Now, if you're talking about things outside of that kind of technical stuff, how can we make the wilderness feel different from the dungeons? I think that whether you want to say it was intentional or not back in the day, however you want to go, but the numbers appearing of things changes. So you go from running into 2 to 8 goblins to potentially 150 goblins. So I like to play up those kinds of things, that now you're running into larger populations. I like to play up that there's just the more possibilities of kind of anything can happen in the wilderness. You know, I've talked about this in the past. I specifically pointed my players to look at the wandering monster charts for the wilderness. Look at the odds of things showing up. It is as likely as a dragon to show up as something a lot less than dragon. You really just, it's a 1 in 8 chance of this. It's a 1 in 8 chance of that. You know, you really can run into anything. And I'll go over this in a separate video, catching up on my campaign, but they ran into a dragon recently. They are not sure yet whether it was something that was sent specifically for them, and if it was sent by somebody or deliberately, then why, and then if it was just happened across them, but it was a wandering encounter or wandering monster check. Ian says, D&D, depending on edition / playstyle, has a standard exploration gameplay loop, and there shouldn't be a difference in flow, whether using a 10-minute dungeon turn or a 4-hour wilderness turn. Correct. I agree with that. I think it should feel, everything should be the same. If we're talking about how to differentiate the wilderness from, let's say, being a bigger dungeon, I think that comes down to making sure that you are accentuating the things that make the wilderness. Kind of anything can happen. Look at all the varieties of things you can run into in the wild. And then I'm not talking about just the creatures, but also just the landscape, and really talking about that. Dungeons tend to be kind of all of a piece, or maybe you'll have one segment that'll look one way and one segment look another time. And then in the wilderness, play up the seasons, play up the sounds of nature, just like you want to play up the stuff that's unnatural or weird. In a dungeon, you want to play up all the natural world or unnatural world or supernatural, whatever it is outside. That sense of the unknown, that sense of you are surrounded, in the way that in a dungeon you can feel safe, pretty much knowing that, okay, I got a wall on my left, I got a wall on my right, so I know where everything's coming from. I got, floor beneath my feet, ceiling above my head. I feel good. That's not to say that some things might not break through the walls, but for the most part, hey, I feel good. This gives me a sense of comfort. I got my angles. I can work out my angles. Out in the wilderness, same thing. Like, where you can move in any direction, but anything else can move and spot you from other directions too. So, play those aspects up. Unfortunately, the author here didn't really give more context. I'm just going to read some of these comments. Doesn't look like any are upvoted more than any other ones, though it looks like the author or the original poster, the OP, did respond to the second one, but I'll read the first one first just because it's at the top. Just by their very nature, they are different. A dungeon is automatically a setting that restricts choice, where a hexcrawl doesn't. In a dungeon, you are constrained by the physical walls. Sheer hexcrawls have similar things, uncrossable rivers, sheer cliffs, but not anywhere near a dungeon. I would even go further and say a sheer cliff isn't uncrossable, and I would not have an uncrossable river. A river could be very rough, could be very deep, but there's always a way. There's always a way. I would never even say it's just you can't. Or even if I never said to my players, I would never put on the map, here's a river that can't be crossed. I mean, oceans can be crossed, so what river can't be crossed? Ian also says the same gameplay style can be applied to either, whether it's discrete systems like AD&D, free flow narrative, or skill challenges. Yep, yeah, I think all our tools are essentially the same. For me, the biggest differences are really the scale, in a sense, the scope. You have a single context for a dungeon, potentially multiple. I don't want to make a bunch of exceptions, because yeah, sure, mega dungeons could have multiple styles, things in there, but you basically going to have one kind of encompassing identity, whereas outside it's going to change. You're in a forest, and that forest may have a single identity, but then you could move into a different part of the forest that's different, or you move out of the forest into the plains, and then that's different. Then there's another forest on the other side, but that forest on the other side of those plains could be completely different than the forest you came from. So you have this whole smorgasbord, this whole rainbow, this whole, however you want to do, a cauldron of just stuff that's can be changing as much or as little as you like. While you can do that in a dungeon, usually you want to keep that in check, because all those things in a dungeon are the kind of context you want your players to use. So you don't want things to be changing. You want a lot of things to maintain the same with variations. So if you're in a particular temple complex and then that temple complex has a catacombs and then it has a chapel and those other things, of course there can be differences between them, but you want things to be more connected. Whereas as you're moving through the wilderness, you really can feel freer to have lots of exceptions or have lots of variety. Whereas at a certain point in the dungeon, sometimes that can actually be counterproductive. Probably there's a point in which it can become counterproductive in the wilderness too, depending on how gonzo you want to get. But we can have lots of these different things that can be encountered. Really, our choice, as much as the player's choices are more free in the wilderness, so as the GM is the amount of things we can draw into the wilderness. Dungeon Master Masterclass, hey, DMMC says, that's funny, I run the opposite way. Dungeons are claustrophobic and easy to get cornered in. The wilderness is open. Like the old saying, a cave's a grave. Yeah, I don't think that's is opposite really, because I think that's something that I said earlier is right. You have more limitations now. If you mean opposite in that you can feel good about being cornered, I mean, being cornered goes two ways, right? Animals often will go for the corners at places because they know that there's a comfort there. Of course, there's also the danger of now there's no way out, right? It's that the same reasons why animals find those kinds of enclosed places comforting is also a big danger to them, because once they're trapped, they're trapped. But from a player standpoint, it makes sense both ways. If you only have one exit, you know which exit to watch. If you only have one exit, anything can trap you in that exit. So I don't say it as opposite. It's that two sides of the same coin kind of thing. Ian's going to have one of their PCs say a cave is a grave in game soon. Yep, sure, why not? All right, let's read this second comment, because this is the one that the OP responded to. So I'm curious what struck them about this. Let me give it a thumb up, or an upvote, I guess. This response was posted by Bugbear Jingo. Timescale is one thing, I guess. Rounds that take hours overland rather than minutes in a dungeon. And claustrophobia? I'm only half kidding. I think they have really different vibes. Like dungeon crawling is close, scary, and dark, while hexcrawling is a bit more expansive and free. Hexcrawling on our table tends to occur between dungeon crawling. They are mutually exclusive elements of the same game. The other bits would be city crawling, I guess, and abstracted downtime. That is to say, I don't think I run one or the other at our table. I think we play both. I'd accentuate the difference by doing heavy torch and resource tracking in dungeons and making camping down there super dangerous. Plotting inch by dangerous inch through the dripping dark. Maybe I'd include some kind of madness tracking based on time spent in the dungeon, like in Darkest Dungeons and some RPGs. Then and some TTRPGs, tabletop RPGs. Then on the Hexcrawl bed, I'd go large on the map scale and have journeys across regions that take weeks, with loads of funky, weird towns, towers, crumbling statues, and ruins to wander upon, kind of like Ultraviolet Grassland style. It's an interesting question. Why do you ask? And to this, Ship Sailing 94 responded, I want to devise a method to create engaging mini settings quickly with a focus on overland explorations. My impression is that Hexcrawl still offers a lot of untapped potential. And then Ulfire Pudding, who I feel like I've read that name before, maybe they have posted stuff, says you want to do a small, dense hex crawl, then a la Hot Springs Island. Each hex is about a mile wide, and there are 2 or 3 things per hex, one of which is hidden or requires prolonged searching. Other good examples are here because many hexes have problems that require going to other hexes to solve, promoting movement and exploration. Then he links to a total party kill something or other. Let's see, and then Ship Sailing says, I'm playing through it right now as a player character, had only a couple sessions so far though. I think talking about Hot Springs Island. So to go back to what Bugbear Jingo said, so he's talking more about kind of the going large and sort of zooming across. I mean, I think you get to that point where your scale changes as your players get more transportation options, whether that's seemingly ever popular at this point, let's give them an airship kind of thing. Final Fantasy VII style, that's what I always think of with airships, and so you can just kind of cruise across the map at will, or you end up traveling by, certainly there's spells, your teleport, flight, anything like that. You zoom up the scale. I think the interesting thing is that you can really, kind of like what Dungeon Master Masterclass mentioned about, you can look at the confined spaces of a dungeon and say, oh, that's kind of comforting from a certain sense, or it's claustrophobic. I think there's the same thing, right? That agoraphobia of the wilderness is something you could play up. And I think some things have tried to do it a little bit. I want to say Into the Word and Wild has a little bit of that in there, at least, in that the same things that can be scary in the dungeon, you're trapped in, you have limited ways out. There's also scary things in the wilderness in that there's no safe haven. Sure, you can make your camp and put a lookout, but you got to have your head on a swivel because stuff could be coming at you from any direction. You don't have a lot of safety. You don't have a lot of things you could put, you could put your back to a tree, but then something could just come and tear down the tree, or something. Maybe something's up the tree and is crawling down to get you on the very log, on the very thing that you were trying to put your back to as a point of safety. There can be very few points of safety in the wilderness, which I think helps accentuate what makes towns and villages and those things so important. Is because they give you those points of absolute, or 99% of the time, time or whatever safety. Are they going to be totally safe? No, because of course things can happen there too, or things can happen to them. But for the most part, why are you going to try to hot tail it to a city or a town instead of just camping out in the wild? Because who the heck knows what's going to get you out there in the wilderness? You have less control over it than you do in a dungeon, because in a dungeon, at least you can say, okay, I'm on level 1, so I have a fairly good chance of the kind of scope of things that are come get me. Sure, there's chances of things much more horrible coming forth, but for the most part, if I'm on level 1, I feel pretty good. If I'm level 4 or 5, say, okay, I feel pretty nice about that. If I'm in the wilderness, sure, at a certain point, maybe you start getting more protection spells. Again, you can teleport things to avoid the wilderness, but you don't know if you're going to get a dragon or just some wolves or some angry bandits or an entire culture of humanoids tromping around. And hey, you may be level 5, but if there are 200 angry orcs out to get you, you don't have a good, your chances may not be so good. You can really tap into fears in both ways. You can certainly tap into scarcity in both ways. I don't know that you need to separate them and say, hey, we're going to have scarcity in the dungeon and not in the wilderness, or just different kinds of scarcity, just going with the different time scales. You're burning through individual torches in the dungeon, you're burning through your daily rations in the wilderness, or your water supply, or both, or however, depending on how you track them. Let me read one more just to see. This one, let's see, we got Paradoxius. One thing is, in terms of overall game structure, dungeon crawls often nest within hex crawls. That is, the hex crawl represents the character's movements through the overall setting of the game, while dungeon crawls are zoom-ins on one especially engaging part of navigating the world. This means dungeon crawls are narrow in scope, more restricted in movement and pathing, and more granular in terms of tracking resources and decision-making, and more self-contained. Hex crawls, on the other hand, are more zoomed out, loosely structured parts of the game that tie the rest of the game together. One big difference in how this works out is that a dungeon can be thought of as one single space. A dungeon will have certain people in it, a certain history, certain themes. It's plausible that anyone in a dungeon knows and cares what's going on elsewhere in the dungeon. A hex crawl takes place over a much wider expanse and contains many spaces within it, so it's possible by moving a few hexes to put yourself far away into a new space with different people, a different history, and different themes. Yep, these are things that we also touched on. Yes, I think people are making good points. I don't know this, so this person seems to kind of want to make kind of a hex crawl sort of mini setting with a focus on overland exploration. I'm curious as to this thing of their impression of hex crawling still offers a lot of untapped potential. I mean, sure. I mean, yes, on the one hand, if they mean potential in terms of things, sure. I'm curious as to what they feel like is missing. Are they talking about technical kind of execution tools? Because there's a ton. We always end up looking through things through kind of the lens that we have. So it is interesting if somebody came through looking at it from a totally different perspective, came up with something kind of a different, just a different way that sort of opened things up in ways that the rest of us hadn't thought about, because we'd been sort of too embedded as hex crawls as we already know them. But it's interesting that people are sort of feeling that they need to define, they kind of coexist. Because I always think they do, but maybe some people definitely will just play dungeon crawling without the travel aspect. I guess that's kind of a 5th edition thing. I don't want to say 5th edition. It's saying that some games just have de-emphasize travel to basically that Indiana Jones, we're just gonna draw an arrow across the map and say in 30 days you reach the sand fortresses of Khartoum, and then you leave it at that, and so you just don't do it. I guess that's the alternative. But it's kind of super interesting, the perspective that they attached to that. Ship Sailing 94 didn't explicitly mention that. Now, Nothing says, I'm curious why he thinks he needs to separate the feeling of hex and dungeon crawls. Are his players saying that they feel the same? Don't they naturally feel different? Yeah, I don't know. He didn't give any context. So I don't know. It's certainly an interesting kind of thought exercise. I would think of it as more of a compound question, kind of, do you want them to feel different from one another? Because certainly there are differences in some of the mechanics. Or not, the kind of noise and things does not exist. Sure, there's maybe stealth play into the wilderness, but really it's more in terms of, broadly speaking, you're going to be, especially if you're running out old school, you're going to kind of be, you're going to get kind of a wandering monster check. You're going to figure out kind of when it happens, and then your sort of stealth comes into play in terms of encounter distance, or whether it's a surprise one way or another. But there's not the same, everything's on that longer scale, and some of the point-to-point things of like stealthily sneaking through a dungeon don't apply in the same way to sneaking through the wilderness, usually, I guess. Or things like we talked about, I guess, except for Elden Ring, we're not worried about traps out in the wilderness. We're not worried about a lot of stuff. We're kind of worried more about navigation. The navigation in the dungeon is that kind of mapping thing, but not directional moving so much. But yeah, it would be kind of, I want to know, like, hey, do we want them to feel different? And if so, why? And then if those through, then, what things we want to move out, because I tend to think that the more seamless you can make it all, the better. I would love if there was a way to even make combat more seamless, but I understand, at least for combat, it makes sense to me, and then I'm able to communicate to my players of why we go into initiative in combat and we don't have initiative other places. And then I will also throw initiative in when I feel like timing is important. So in a let's say there was a rickety bridge across a chasm, I might use initiative then, or I might have them dial out their orders because of the situation that timing's important. But for most things out in the wilderness, timing within seconds isn't important, whereas it can be in combat, and in dungeons, timing in minutes may be important, but not in seconds. But yeah, I don't know exactly where they're coming from, other than it's kind of one of those posts that ultimately it's like I think I have this idea for something and kind of want you guys to flesh it out for me. Like I have an idea for a setting. Or I want to write a setting, but I'm not sure what's popular, what people are gonna like. So let me poll the community and find out why. I would like to know more from Ship Sailing 94 of what they're looking for, but it seems like they're, at this point anyway, they're not super interested in giving away what they want so much as mining others for what they think.